Jake had always been drawn to the mysterious forest at the edge of town. The locals said that it was cursed, that anyone who entered never came out alive. But Jake was determined to uncover the truth. As he wandered deeper into the forest, he could feel the weight of history bearing down on him. The trees towered above him, and the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves under his feet. But as Jake stepped deeper into the forest, he knew that he had made a grave mistake. The trees seemed to close in around him, and the air grew thick with the stench of decay. Suddenly, he heard a soft whisper in the distance. It grew louder as he approached a clearing, and he could make out the words, "Turn back, before it's too late." Jake tried to run, but the forest seemed to go on forever. Every step he took was harder than the last, and the whispering grew louder and more urgent. Just when all seemed lost, Jake stumbled across an old cabin in the woods. It was filled with ancient artifacts, and he found a mysterious book that he knew was the key to escaping the cursed forest. Jake opened the book, and suddenly, the forest began to shake. The trees cracked and crumbled, and the ground gave way beneath his feet. Jake found himself tumbling down into a dark, endless abyss. He fell for what seemed like an eternity, until he landed in a pool of icy water. When he looked up, he saw a figure looming over him. It was the spirit of the cursed forest, and its eyes burned with an otherworldly fire. But Jake was not afraid. He knew that he had faced his fears and emerged victorious. With a final burst of strength, he swam to the surface and emerged from the water, victorious over the curse of the mysterious forest. Amy had always been fascinated by the old abandoned house on the hill. The locals said that it was cursed, that anyone who entered never came out alive. But Amy was determined to uncover the truth. As she climbed the stairs to the front door, she could feel the weight of history bearing down on her. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the only sound was the soft echo of her footsteps. But as Amy stepped inside, she knew that she had made a grave mistake. The door slammed shut behind her, and the room was plunged into darkness. Suddenly, she heard a soft whisper in the distance. It grew louder as she approached the stairs, and she could make out the words, "Get out, before it's too late." Amy tried to run, but the stairs seemed to go on forever. Every step she took was harder than the last, and the whispering grew louder and more urgent. Just when all seemed lost, Amy stumbled across a room filled with ancient artifacts. She found a mysterious amulet, and she knew that it was the key to escaping the cursed house. Amy put on the amulet, and suddenly, the house began to shake. The walls cracked and crumbled, and the floor gave way beneath her feet. Amy found herself tumbling down into a dark, endless abyss. She fell for what seemed like an eternity, until she landed in a pool of icy water. When she looked up, she saw a figure looming over her. It was the spirit of the cursed house, and its eyes burned with an otherworldly fire. But Amy was not afraid. She knew that she had faced her fears and emerged victorious. With a final burst of strength, she swam to the surface and emerged from the water, victorious over the curse of the old abandoned house on the hill. Emily had always been afraid of the dark. As a child, she would leave the hallway light on all night, too scared to close her eyes and drift off to sleep. As an adult, Emily had learned to manage her fear, but one night, everything changed. She woke up in the middle of the night, and the room was pitch black. She could feel the weight of someone sitting on the edge of her bed. Emily tried to scream, but she couldn't make a sound. She could feel the figure leaning over her, their hot breath on her face. She could smell the stench of decay, and the touch of their cold fingers on her skin. Suddenly, the figure disappeared, and Emily was left alone in the dark. She turned on the light, but there was no one there. The next night, Emily woke up again to find the figure sitting on the edge of her bed. This time, she could see their face. It was twisted in pain, with rotting flesh and empty eyes. Emily tried to run, but the figure was too fast. It chased her through the house, its unearthly howls echoing through the halls. Just when all seemed lost, Emily stumbled across a dusty old book in the attic. It was a book of ancient spells, and she knew what she had to do. Emily recited the spell with trembling hands, and the figure vanished in a burst of light. Emily was left alone in the dark, but she was no longer afraid. She had faced her fears and emerged victorious. From that day on, Emily knew that she would never be afraid of the dark again. But every now and then, she could still feel the presence of the figure, watching her from the shadows. Samantha had always been fascinated by the old abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. She had heard the stories of the patients who had been mistreated and left to die in their cells, and she was determined to explore the decaying ruins. As she made her way through the dark and shadowy corridors, she could feel the weight of history bearing down on her. The air was thick with the stench of death and decay, and the only sound was the soft echo of her footsteps. But as Samantha turned a corner, she heard a faint whispering in the distance. The voices grew louder as she approached a closed door, and she could make out the words, "Help us." Samantha tried to open the door, but it was locked tight. She could feel the presence of the tortured souls trapped inside, their anguish and pain permeating the air around her. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Samantha found herself face to face with a group of spirits. They were the patients who had been left to rot in their cells, and their eyes burned with an otherworldly fire. Samantha tried to run, but the spirits were too fast. They chased her through the corridors, their hands reaching out to grab her. Samantha could feel their icy fingers closing around her throat, and she knew that she was going to die. Just when all seemed lost, Samantha found herself back in the main hall of the asylum. She stumbled outside into the bright sunlight, gasping for breath. As she looked back at the asylum, she could see the spirits watching her from the windows. They were still trapped inside, their tortured souls unable to escape the walls that had held them captive for so long. Cassie had always loved the old Victorian house on the hill. She had dreamed of living there ever since she was a little girl, and when she finally got the chance to buy it, she jumped at the opportunity. But as soon as she moved in, strange things began to happen. Objects moved on their own, doors slammed shut, and Cassie could hear the sound of someone walking through the house when she knew she was alone. One night, as she was lying in bed, Cassie heard a soft whisper in her ear. She turned over, but no one was there. She heard the whisper again, and this time she could make out the words, "Get out." Cassie tried to ignore it, but the activity in the house only got worse. She could feel a presence watching her wherever she went, and she knew that she was not alone in the house. One night, as Cassie was getting ready for bed, she saw a figure in the mirror behind her. It was a woman with long, black hair and a pale face. Cassie turned around, but no one was there. The woman in the mirror began to reach out to her, her long fingers curling around Cassie's neck. Cassie tried to scream, but the woman's grip was too strong. When Cassie woke up, she was lying on the floor. She looked around, but the woman was gone. Cassie knew then that she had to leave the house, and she never returned. To this day, the old Victorian house on the hill stands empty, haunted by the spirit of the woman with the long, black hair. Mark had always been a skeptic when it came to the paranormal. But when he moved into his new apartment, strange things began to happen. At first, it was just little things. Objects moved on their own, doors opened and closed by themselves, and a faint whispering could be heard in the dead of night. But soon, the activity escalated. Mark began to see shadowy figures moving in the corners of his eyes, and the whispers grew louder and more menacing. He started to feel a cold breath on the back of his neck, and the feeling of being watched became overwhelming. One night, as Mark was lying in bed, a figure appeared at the foot of his bed. It was a woman with long, tangled hair and a face twisted in pain. She reached out to touch him, and he could feel her icy fingers closing around his throat. Mark tried to scream, but he couldn't make a sound. The woman's grip tightened, and he felt himself slipping away into the darkness. When he woke up, he was in a hospital. The doctors told him that he had been found unconscious in his apartment, with no signs of physical trauma. But Mark knew the truth. He had been visited by a malevolent spirit, and it had nearly taken his life. From that day on, he never stayed in that apartment alone, haunted by the memory of the ghostly figure that had nearly claimed him. Jenna and her friends were excited to spend the weekend camping in the woods. But as the sun began to set, they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone in the forest. As they sat around the campfire, they heard a sound of rustling leaves and twigs snapping in the distance. Jenna's friend, Jake, went to investigate, but he never returned. Panic set in as they searched for Jake, but all they found was a trail of blood leading deeper into the woods. They followed the trail until they stumbled upon an abandoned cabin hidden in the trees. The cabin was old and decrepit, and the air inside was thick with the stench of death. As they explored the dark and dusty rooms, they found signs of a struggle and heard strange noises coming from the shadows. Suddenly, they heard Jake's voice calling out from the darkness. They followed the sound, but what they found was beyond anything they could have imagined. Jake was lying on the floor, surrounded by a group of creatures that seemed to be part human, part animal. The creatures had glowing eyes and razor-sharp claws, and they were hungry for blood. Jenna and her friends fought back, but the creatures were too powerful. They were outnumbered and outmatched, and one by one, they fell to the creatures' relentless attacks. As Jenna watched her friends being torn apart, she knew that they had stumbled upon something ancient and evil in the woods, something that should have remained hidden and undisturbed. In the end, she was the only one left standing, haunted by the memories of that terrifying night in the cabin in the woods. Oliver had always been fascinated by the old, abandoned asylum on the outskirts of town. The rumors of patients who had been mistreated and left to die within its walls only added to the eerie mystique surrounding the building. One night, Oliver and his friends decided to break into the asylum and explore its dark and twisted halls. As they made their way through the crumbling corridors, they couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Strange noises echoed through the halls, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. As they entered one particularly decrepit wing of the asylum, they found themselves face to face with a figure dressed in rags and covered in scars. The figure lunged at them with a maniacal scream, and Oliver and his friends fled in terror. But the asylum had other plans for them. As they made their way through the labyrinthine corridors, they encountered other patients, some still alive, others long dead and rotting. The walls themselves seemed to shift and twist, leading them deeper into the heart of the asylum. Oliver and his friends could hear the sound of something following them, something with inhuman strength and a thirst for blood. They tried to hide, but the asylum seemed to anticipate their every move. They found themselves trapped in a never-ending maze of madness and horror, with no hope of escape. In the end, Oliver was the only one who made it out of the asylum alive. But he was never the same after that night. He was haunted by the things he had seen and the sounds he had heard within those twisted walls, and he knew that the asylum would always be a part of him, a dark, twisted piece of his soul that he could never escape. Lucy had always been afraid of the old abandoned mine on the outskirts of town. The stories of miners who had perished in the depths of the mine and the eerie whispers that emanated from its dark tunnels had always given her the chills. One day, her curiosity got the best of her, and she decided to explore the mine with her friends. They entered cautiously, the only light coming from their flashlights as they made their way through the narrow passageways. As they went deeper into the mine, the air grew thicker and more oppressive. Lucy felt a sense of unease creeping over her, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Suddenly, their flashlights flickered and went out, plunging the group into darkness. Panic set in as they tried to find their way out, but the mine seemed to shift and change around them. The walls began to close in, and strange whispers filled the air. Lucy felt something brush past her in the dark, and heard a sound of footsteps echoing through the tunnels. In the distance, they could see a faint glow that seemed to be coming from the end of the tunnel. As they stumbled towards it, the whispers grew louder, and Lucy could hear the sound of something slithering just out of sight. Finally, they emerged from the mine into a large, cavernous room filled with strange, otherworldly creatures. Lucy could barely make out their twisted shapes and glowing eyes in the dim light. As they approached, the creatures began to close in around them, and Lucy realized with horror that they were trapped in the heart of the mine with no hope of escape. The creatures began to close in, their whispers growing louder and more malevolent. Lucy and her friends screamed in terror as the creatures descended upon them, their fate sealed in the depths of the abandoned mine forever. It was a dark and stormy night when Rachel and her friends decided to explore the abandoned mansion at the edge of town. As they crept through the overgrown garden and up the creaky front steps, they couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding. Once inside, the group split up to explore different parts of the mansion. Rachel wandered down a dimly lit hallway, a flashlight barely illuminating the peeling wallpaper and musty furniture. As she turned a corner, she suddenly heard a loud crash from upstairs. Heart pounding, Rachel raced up the stairs to find her friends. But as she climbed higher, the air grew colder and her flashlight beam flickered ominously. She could hear strange whispers and laughter echoing through the halls, and felt as though something was watching her every move. Finally, Rachel burst into a large, ornate bedroom, where she found her friends huddled in a corner. They were trembling with fear and pointed to a shadowy figure looming in the corner of the room. As Rachel approached, the figure turned to reveal a twisted, grinning face that seemed to be made of shadow and smoke. Panicking, the group fled down the stairs, only to find that the front door was locked tight. They were trapped in the mansion with the shadowy figure and whatever other horrors lurked within its walls. As they searched for another way out, Rachel and her friends encountered more terrifying creatures, ghostly apparitions, slithering tentacles, and sinister whispers that seemed to come from all directions at once. With each passing moment, the mansion seemed to grow more and more malevolent, its walls closing in around them and its horrors multiplying. In the end, Rachel and her friends never found a way out of the mansion. Their fate remains a mystery to this day, but some say that their spirits still wander its dark halls, trapped forever in a never-ending nightmare of fear and horror.